I don't know. But to get back to the idea of like manhood and masculinity and these things, do you guys have any memories growing up of like when you butted up against the concept of masculinity or what being a man or a real man was? Where you're kind of like, I don't think that's me. I don't think it really fits in with what I like. Because I don't think there's anyone out there that didn't go through this. Like I think there's always, unless like I don't know, you're in one of the more religious households where like you're okay, this is what a man is, and you're just a happy soldier to go through it. I wonder if you guys had any like experiences growing up when you first had that difference.
I'll jump in. I mean, and so for me, actually, my father wasn't around my whole life. So there was this sort of hole, and I didn't really have somebody to model off of. So for me, actually, my whole life has been really about figuring out what a man is because I didn't have an older brother. There's just like almost all women in my family. So it's very lonely and isolating, and I had to look towards others. So I have spent, especially through my like teenage and early 20 years, just acquiring lots of mentors, usually male mentors of various kinds of ways. Sometimes it's professional, sometimes personal, and just sort of studying how they are, how they act, and different things along these lines. So for me, that's a very um, that's a topic I can relate with quite a bit because what I have learned as I've gotten older and older is actually the I've learned a lot of what not to do, but without actually having the experience of like having that close sort of male role model in your life in the day to day, especially, you don't really actually understand what a man is or what a man does and things like that, and then how that relates to you as well. So, especially through my 20s, was me actually figuring out what a man is, through my own mistakes and my own experiments, etc. Or at least what my association would be with that. So for me, I became very close, usually with the fathers of my girlfriends, and that would sort of be me, kind of like that. That was my first serious girlfriend. I was so close with her father. The hardest reason, even though I knew the relationship wasn't going to move forward, the hardest part of breaking up was because of my relationship with her dad, for example. I knew that was the breakup, really. So, these are things that are, at least this is sort of my experience in this topic.
Wow. Yeah, I like that idea of like picking mentors because you didn't have something to rebel against. I think a lot of people would have fathers that, good or bad, there'd always be something like, oh, I want to be different. I want to differentiate myself. Where you could kind of like go to the buffet of masculinity and see like, okay, let's try this. That doesn't taste good. Let's try this. Oh, this feels better. Because that's really interesting. Because even like for me growing up, like my dad's like a Italian immigrant, like no feelings allowed kind of, and he's evolved a little bit through his life, but it was more like my grandfather on my mom's side and my uncle on my mom's side, super open, gregarious people, like loving, jokey, like all this stuff. But I remember just even going to like elementary school and high school, where it's like I played sports, but I didn't really care about any of these teams, and all the guys were just talking about sports all the time. So I'd have to like, I remember like I would get up earlier to watch Sports Center in the morning, so I would just be able to be part of these conversations. I remember after university, like remembering like being like actively thinking like, okay, I don't need to do that anymore. like that's like I am who I am now. But I remember consciously being like, okay, well, if I'm going to be part of this group of people, all right, I guess I got to find out what happened in the hockey game last night when I fucking hate hockey more than anything.
Sure, you're Canadian.
And yeah, yeah, I also can't skate. So like there's a lot of these things that like even growing up, like I liked, performing. I'd sing around the house and all these things, and my mom was being like kitchen singer dancer, and so I remember thinking like this doesn't feel like a manly thing, like growing up. So like there's all sorts of these things throughout our life.
Yeah. For me, I have a whole bunch of thoughts on the topic. I forgot half of them because I was listening, but I mentioned earlier, the priesthood, and for some context, I was raised Mormon, right, in Utah, which is, so like basically everyone around me was Mormon.
Wow.
And in the Mormon church, which it basically included all my neighbors, there is, a brotherhood. And so, every Sunday we meet, we all meet together as a whole congregation, and then we separate, as men and women. And so I was always spending time with these men, and they were mentors, many of them. It's like I had many fathers and brothers and different examples. And I think for me, it was always just kind of this path. It's what, it's all I knew. And so when I decided to leave that was when I really confronted it. All right, now, what does it mean to be a man that's not, on that path? And so, it's been the last 20 something years of my life that I've been, kind of figuring that out on my own and finding, my own, new mentors and new examples of the type of man that I would like to be. Now, that's not to say that, I didn't gain a whole bunch of lessons and values from that community, like being a gentleman, right? My father's just the most gentle guy, just a great example of manhood in that respect. But, when you don't, especially when you're leaving a religion and you want to kind of just separate it all to go figure it out, I had to kind of figure that. My other thought just on the subject is, regardless of that, when growing up, I don't think we realize we're doing this to each other. And at a really young age, even if you think as like 4 years old, if you cried, you'd be like, don't be a sissy, don't be a girl.
Yes.
And so you just, you immediately kind of put that away and, say, oh, well, I can't share my feelings. I can't be like that. And you mentioned earlier coming to the group. It's like we already know how to do it, right? As soon as we're in that environment, we're like, oh, I'm ready to share. But we just don't let ourselves do it.
Right.
And I think that's, one of the things that I've learned even more recently, when it comes to, I can be a man, not a sissy, and, share and be vulnerable.
Right. Yeah, because there's a lot I've been reading recently on this topic, and I'm really coming to understand that, like, really, yeah, as early as 4, like, boys and girls are treated completely differently. And so imagine, like, every boy with different degrees of, depending who your parents were, but like not being able to have your feelings when you're hurt, when you're sad. Like, a lot of girls are allowed to have all of their feelings, more or less. Obviously, I'm generalizing, but I would say the vast majority of boys are like, no, don't cry, don't like. There's an author I've been reading recently called Gabor Mate. He's like a psychologist from Canada, and he was mentioning on a couple of podcasts. He mentioned Jordan Peterson, who's obviously getting a lot of like this young male angst all riled up. And he said that Peterson said that if a child is crying, they should be made to sit alone until they're ready to come back to normal. And Dr. Mate, he was like, this is crazy. Like, kids are just trying to be kids, and they're like, if they can't get a cookie, of course they're frustrated. That's a normal reaction to a kid. But you're taught, if you don't behave well, if you don't, be the way that this parent thinks you should, then you will get no affection. So just think of all that suppression also happening to men, like generations and generations of men who have no idea what their feelings are like because they were told from 4 years old, which is a crazy age to do that to any human, that you're like, okay, my feelings don't matter, so like, let's just put this down till there's a heart attack at 55. So I don't know, it's nuts to me.
Dr. Gabor Mate, I remember one of the things he said, I think it was on a podcast, he said, try telling a gorilla to let their child just cry it out, right? It just doesn't make sense when you think about, evolution. Like we created this construct that doesn't really make any sense, right? So basically, follow your gut. Like what do you feel like doing when your baby's crying? You feel like pick him up.
Right.
But like you say, I mean, coming back when your question was, when did you confront this thing with manhood? I think it's hard to think of when that first happened because I can't remember before I was 4 years old, right? And it just happened, just socially, naturally, for some reason. we do it. And I don't know if that's a social thing that we do or if it's a natural, instinctive thing that we do to make ourselves hard so that we can be strong out on the hunt or whatever,
Yeah.
why we've done that. But fortunately, like you were saying, it seems like in today's world, it is much more not only acceptable, but it's and I don't want to say trendy, but it's becoming much more common to allow us. And it seems like men, at least in this group, are looking for that
Right.
openness.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just
You can
thinking there.
pass.
No, it's. I mean, I'm just reflecting on what you guys have said and trying to put it in context of my own experience. Which, I mean, I don't think I've had a moment of, oh wow, I feel different, or I feel like, oh, this doesn't fit. I mean, I think I can point to that various points in my life, but I always, perhaps that was more of a, I think I'm too much of a nerd for this, or I think I'm a bit too shy for this, or I think I'm a bit too, you know, um, what's the word? Uh, Thoughtful for the kind of going out and gregarious kind of behavior and things like that. I've never quite linked it to manhood, but thinking around what you're sort of saying, what I do perceive in myself, my own experiences, I think over the years I've become more and more encouraged, or perhaps by my natural inclination plus the sort of feedback in I'm an engineer, so the career I chose, that you start to just be hyper rational about stuff, hyper rationalize things, and that by its very nature kind of ignores this kind of the emotional side of stuff, and there's a definite need for balance, right?
Right.
And so whenever I find myself, and I think this is one of the themes of the group we're in, that we're sort of trying to acknowledge that side of things, and I find that really difficult, and I just find it's only in I suppose that the acknowledgement of that, the perspective that, oh, I find that difficult, is something reasonably new for me over the last few years, as opposed to, whereas before it would just be, oh, well, here's my logical way of thought, and I'll make a decision and sort of move on. But I don't think it ever addressed, perhaps, either a difficulty I was having or the underlying issue or whatever. There was no room or no space for that. And so, yeah, I don't know where that comes from per se. Is that a product of the sort of society we're in, or your sort of upbringing, the emotional programming you have when you're a kid? Certainly for me, it's been reinforced through my kind of what I was naturally good at as a logical type guy, kind of left-brained, I guess. And then the career choice I had as an engineer, where that's what you're doing day in, day out, and it becomes like that's your natural kind of muscle memory, if you like. That's your reflex. That's what you go to. And so I think, yeah, it's been a real kind of effort for me to really acknowledge that other side, and work on it and try and develop it, I suppose. And that's not something I think you normally associate with the topics today, rather than manhood, as it were, or masculinity. That is something, yeah, that yeah, that I'm making efforts to create space for.